My name is Jessie and I interviewed Pery Bellegarde.
Since I've been about 21, 22, been attending Sundance lodges and sweat lodges and all sorts of First Nation ceremonies, because that's very important. It's like the identity, because we've survived and went through the residential school systems as First Nations people in Canada. There's two things I would say that hurt First Nations people in Canada. One is the residential schools themselves being imposed, which basically killed the child, took the pride away from the child and in his individualness and his family, and no language, no culture, cutting of the hair, taking them away from their family and their communities. And then you put on top of that sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, everything. It really killed our people. And the other thing was the imposition of the Indian Act. The Indian Act basically kept the Indians on the reserve. You couldn't leave without a permit system. We couldn't vote in elections till 1961. Couldn't sell our own wheat without a permit till 1959. Like, it was always there. Didn't have access to legal counsel till 1957. So those two things really hurt First Nations people. And so when people ask me about my spiritual background, it's very much so First Nations, because again, it wasn't allowed to happen, and there's a sense of pride now coming back in it, and so I follow that way a lot, and my sons follow that way, and it's something that's very much a part of our lives, because the other aspect to it as well is there's freedom from alcohol and drugs in that system. And that's very important for our people to rise above, because through that Indian Act system and the residential school system, the whole point about being proud of who you are, nobody felt good about being Indian. Nobody felt proud about being First Nations people. It was no good to be Indian. And so to break that down, people are getting a sense of pride back in who they are as First Nations people. So that's a very big part of my life.
Okay, and could you tell me a little bit about where you grew up?
I grew up on Little Blackberry Reserve. I was born at the Fort Capel Union Hospital that they're just tearing down. I was born there in '62, and grew up on Little Blackberry Reserve. Attended Good Eve School from grade 1 to grade 9. Then I came here for grades 10, 11, 12, and graduated in 1980. And then I went to University of Regina, and came out with a business degree in 1985, 84, 85. First Treaty Indian to graduate from the U of R with a degree in business. And then I've been in politics ever since.
And where do you live now?
Saskatoon, right now, because I'm currently FSIN Chief, Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations Chief. And but I come back home, so I always say Blackbear's home.
So could you tell me a little bit about your profession, like as Chief of the FSIN?
It's a lot of lobbying, a lot of meetings with both federal government and provincial governments and municipal governments. And I'm going to shut this off. Just keeps going and going. Just a second, I gotta shut this off. You can edit this, eh?
Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it.
Okay, so yeah, a lot of lobbying, do a lot of meetings, trying to bring about policy and legislative change as it relates to First Nations people, both locally, provincially, nationally, and internationally. So a lot of meetings with the Prime Minister's office, a lot of meetings with different members of cabinet in Ottawa, meeting with the Premier, Brad Wall and his cabinet, different files, different issues, trying to influence, the legislation that they're drafting, so it's more open-minded and respectful of First Nations inherent and treaty rights, trying to make sure that there's something in every provincial and federal budget as it relates to First Nations people, because basically there's still just too much poverty amongst our people in Canada. So we're trying to deal with that. And I always make the point that Canada is a great place to live. In fact, according to United Nations Human Development Index, it's rated number 6, the best country in the world to live. But for First Nations people, if you use those same indices for us, we're 63rd. And in a rich country like Canada, that's just not acceptable. So we've really got to change things, and we've got to collectively do it together. And I was just attending a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Edmonton this past weekend, and it's the last major gathering of the TRC, and that's dealing with the residential schools, the impacts of the residential schools. and the intergenerational impacts and the trauma and everything else. And there's a constant theme that First Nations people can't do it alone, and we have to also learn to forgive and move on. And forgiveness is a very powerful thing. But it's going to be the young people that really bring about true reconciliation, because the residential schools is really part of Canada's history, and to educate everybody about the impacts is ongoing. And to really bring about true reconciliation, it's going to be the young people that do that, so they have an understanding and awareness of what happened, and collectively bring together their strengths through love and care and compassion, that all people are great in this country, and that should be respected and celebrated.
Okay, so throughout your career, you've been referred to as having unwavering commitment to be of service to the concerns of First Nations in Canada and being a strong advocate for inherent treaty rights, which you're just saying too. And so what are some of the challenges you've been through when you're advocating for those rights and concerns?
Lack of awareness and understanding. I would say they're not adequately taught. Our First Nations people don't really know them as well, and our non-First Nations brothers and sisters don't know about them as well. There's a spirit and intent to that treaty. There's a spirit and intent to all of our rights we have. They're fundamental human rights. And so the biggest challenge is making sure that people have a good education and awareness about those rights. And that leads to understanding, that will lead to action, which will bring about change. Because we've had treaties since 1874, when Little Black Bear entered into it with the Crown. We've always made the point that nations make treaties, treaties do not make nations. But they've never really been honored or implemented. And that's the issue, still in 2014. And so the biggest challenge is getting people on side and aware about the importance of the relationship with the Crown that we have, and as well a relationship with the Creator, and as well moving towards new mechanisms for full implementation. And I think I always make this point as well, that if people can't get their head around the rights issue, then get their head around the business case. There's a business case to be made that if you don't deal with these things, they're ongoing lawful legal obligations, number one, but as well it's a way of addressing the issue of poverty. And there's a high social cost of poverty. And if we can get our heads around that, people will embrace the whole rights agenda. And that's what's got to happen across Canada. So that's some of the biggest challenges I have.
So where would you like to see First Nations people in the future?
Rising up from 63rd in terms of quality of life to the same level as everybody else. That's where I want to see. I always say First Nations people should be proud of who they are, of their language, their identity as First Nations people, and get a good, solid education, kindergarten to grade 12, university, technical vocational skills, but never forget who you are, where you come from. That means your languages and your ceremonies, and have those two things in place. I see First Nations people being around cabinet tables. I see First Nations people becoming CEOs and chairmen of the board of both private and public sector industries. First Nations people, there's not enough jobs on the reserves, so you have to move beyond sometimes. And so I see First Nations people really taking their rightful place and coming out of the 63rd in terms of quality of life to everybody else in terms of good quality education, good quality homes, good quality jobs, a bright future for their kids. That's where we need to keep going. And for First Nations people, we're 4% of the population in Canada. We're 15% of the population in Saskatchewan. Our numbers are getting higher. No question, we're the fastest growing segment of Saskatchewan's population. And so both public and private sector, federal governments, provincial governments, industry, making key strategic investments in First Nations people, education and training is key. And First Nations people, where I see them going, it's a brighter future. They got to come back to the Red Road way, I'm going to say it that way. And because there really is a lot of freedom from alcohol and drugs, and getting wellness, a wellness strategy in place, and moving into the rightful place in terms of jobs and employment, and dreaming big. Who knows, you might see a First Nations person that's Prime Minister of Canada or Premier of this province. That can happen.
So you've said the treaties are based on peaceful coexistence and respect. Do you think that there's a lack of those values in Canada today?
Totally. Peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, and mutually benefiting from the land and resource wealth. That's our understanding. When Little Black Bear put his 4-direction mark on that parchment, it was in the sense of we're going to share, and we're going to get along as brothers and sisters. That was the understanding. And what we see now is not that understanding being implemented. Because if there really was a full implementation of the treaty according to the spirit and intent, you wouldn't see the poverty. You wouldn't see the lack of housing in the reserve communities. You wouldn't see the lack of adequate schools and caps on education funding. You know, there's huge disparities. And you wouldn't see one side benefiting and the other side not benefiting. So there's a total inequity in terms of the implementation of the treaties. And that's what's got to change. Because, again, how much billions upon billions of GDP, gross domestic product, that have been generated from the land and resource wealth, of which Indigenous peoples are sharing. And it's just not right that there's so much poverty. And so when people talk about peaceful coexistence and mutual respect and mutually benefiting from the land and the resource wealth, yes, that's the understanding. But we've still yet to see that covenant fulfilled. We've still yet to see that inequity balanced. And that's why young people have to work together and bring about that change. It's going to be the young people that help bring about that change. And that's the challenge now moving forward.
So how do you think we can improve the relationships between the government and First Nations people?
Well, I always say there's got to be more recognition of that treaty relationship with the Crown. There's got to be new mechanisms. For example, Canada was founded on treaty commissioners. Alexander Morris was a treaty commissioner that came out on behalf of the Crown, on behalf of the Queen, that entered into these sacred arrangements with the chiefs. Where's our treaty commissioner now? You know, with the power and the authority of the Crown, with the terms of reference, authority, and mandate to look at treaty implementation. You know, a case can be made that we've got to look at new mechanisms like that again to implement. Canada's Constitution, Section 35, recognizes existing Aboriginal treaty rights. Well, that's the highest law in this land now, called Canada's Constitution. How do you implement that? Is that a full box of rights? We believe it is. What mechanisms do you have in place now to implement that? So, Treaty Commissioner is one example. Developing our own justice systems, developing our own court systems. There's a whole slew of things that can happen. It's just a matter... It comes down to recognition of Aboriginal rights and title. It comes down to recognition of First Nations government as, I wouldn't say a third order of government, but also the first order of government, you know, because, again, we had our own laws and customs and systems of governance in place before the Europeans came here. So we had a system, we had a governing structure, and that should be recognized. And again, there's room in this land for everybody. There's room in this country for all levels of government. And there's got to be that respect both ways. And I've always used these words, you know, government tried to civilize Indian people, then assimilate Indian people, now it's terminate Indian people, now it's more into integration. But integration can work both ways. Integration can work both ways. I came to school here. I went to school in Goodeve, Saskatchewan, provincial school system. It'd be great to see non-Indigenous students go to a First Nation school so there's really true integration. You know, so you have a better understanding and balance and walk a mile in each other's shoes or moccasins, if you will, to really get a good understanding of what people go through. And that's a challenge moving forward.
All right, so you just mentioned this a little bit, but how do you think we can improve understanding between First Nations and non-First Nations?
Well, that's one way I just mentioned, but teaching treaties in the school, having more First Nations teachers, more role models, more interaction. We're all people. Like in our worldview, there's when our elders go to ceremony and we go to ceremony, it's like we're all connected in the world. You know, they'll pray for the two-legged people. That's you and me. It doesn't matter if you're white, black, red, yellow, or brown. The two-legged tribe. We're supposed to work collectively together. And then they also acknowledge the four directions. They acknowledge Mother Earth, where everything comes from. Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. We're all part of that creation. And they acknowledge all the spirit forms, the life forms, the ones that crawl, the ones that swim, the ones that fly. They're our relatives. You know, that's our worldview. And having that understood, I think will create a bigger awareness throughout the world and throughout the land that we're all connected, that our futures are so inextricably intertwined. There's not an us and them. It's really a we. And if you take that worldview, people will understand the importance of protecting the land and the water for future generations. They'll consider the importance of protecting Mother Earth itself, where all life comes from. Because what are we leaving for our children and grandchildren and 7 generations down the road? So having those things taught in the school systems, I think, would be a very powerful tool for bringing a greater awareness and breaking down barriers or walls between us and them, that we're all people.
So would you say like that our relationship with the land would need to change for, you know, Canada's people to become more united and stuff?
Our relationship with the land is one of exploitation. That's what I see. And so it's got to change, no question. Because all life comes from Mother Earth and the land. So we have to respect that and care for that going forward. Because what are we leaving for the next generation? What footprint are we leaving? You know, and so that's got to be respected.
Right, so back to the TRC, you just mentioned this earlier, but you've been a supporter of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Do you think that that event and events similar to it are crucial to the unity of Canada's people?
Totally. Yeah, that's one thing, but they're coming to a close, June of 2015. What then? What are the next steps? You know, like reconciliation doesn't happen overnight. To bring about true reconciliation, people have to know about Canada's history. Know that through the residential schools, it wasn't just bad enough taking kids from their parents and their homes and their community. They did experiments depriving those kids of food. Some got good, healthy food, others got vitamins, others didn't. You know, total abuse. I call it cultural genocide. That's Canada's history. The prisons and confinements of the Indian Act, not able to leave the reserve without a permit. You know, in fact, apartheid in South Africa was modeled on Canada's Indian reservation system. It's not right, and that's Canada's history. Starving our people into near annihilation so they'd be forced to sign the treaty. There's also that view, you know, giving out diseased blankets, you know, with smallpox, and tuberculosis, and measles, and everything else. It was annihilation. That's Canada's history. And we don't say these things to make people feel guilty, but be aware of it. It's Canada's dark secret. And the best way to deal with secrets is expose things to the light of day. Then you can move forward. Truth and reconciliation. You can't hide the truth. Just speak the truth, tell the truth, learn from the truth, and move forward. And TRC is all part of that. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is a national process. It brings together everybody. You know, it can't be just for First Nations people. It's government, it's industry, it's church groups, it's non-governmental organizations. It's everybody working together to bring about reconciliation in this country. And it's all about attitudinal change, you know, and people seeing Indigenous peoples as a distinct group of people, but seeing them not as the stereotypical drunk, stupid, lazy, drunk welfare Indian, a burden on taxpayers, and seeing individual people, like Indian people, for really what they are, proud of who they are, their language, their identity, contributing huge amounts of things to this country, you know, through the land and resource wealth, and having survived 400 or 500 years of colonization, and the fact that we're still here. My biggest fear is that you're never going to hear our languages spoken again. There's 58 different nations in Canada, from the Mi'kmaq, Pascomadi, the Mohawk, the Algonquin, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Bloods, all the different tribes. There's 58. And what happens when those languages are no longer spoken? When you don't hear Nakota or Assiniboine spoken? It's a wiping out of a people. That's a greatest travesty in this land. You know, Canada is a bilingual country, French and English. What about the other 58 different Indigenous nations? Was Canada really founded on 2 founding nations, French and English? I always say in a respectful way, makes you think about that. You know, we don't have a country called France across the big water, where French will always be spoken in France. Where will Algonquin be spoken? Where will Assiniboine be spoken? Where will Cree be spoken? Where will Dakota be spoken? Where will Mi'kmaq be spoken? There's got to be a bigger focus here in this country, the Indigenous peoples' territories. And it's all done in a respectful way. It can happen.
All right, well, that's all the questions I have for you, but this was good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.